They should have fallen in 6 months. The words were spoken quietly, almost as if saying them too loudly might reveal doubt. Berlin, winter of 1942. The air inside the war room felt heavy, not from heat, but from certainty that had lasted too long. A massive map stretched across the wall, pins and lines marking a continent reshaped by force and speed. France had collapsed. The Low Countries were silent. Across hundreds of miles, control had come quickly, almost predictably. And yet, just beyond the edge of that red expanse, one island remained. Britain, small on the map, isolated, still there. General Erich Falken stood with his hands behind his back, studying the same coastline he had studied for months. The English Channel, barely 21 miles at its narrowest, now felt like a distance no strategy had closed. Around him, other officers spoke in measured tones, discussing logistics, supply lines, projections that still assumed an outcome everyone had once agreed upon. "They are cut off," one said. "No continental support. No viable path forward." Falken didn't respond. He had heard it all before. He had believed it, too. For a long time, it had made sense. Wars followed patterns. Pressure created collapse. Isolation created surrender. That was how systems worked. That was how nations behaved. He picked up a report from the table. Papers slightly worn at the edges. Ink clean, precise. Intelligence summaries. Observations. Numbers. But what caught his attention was not the data. It was what wasn't there. No indication of negotiation. No request for terms. No signal of exhaustion strong enough to break structure. Just continuity. Just resistance. Across the ocean, thousands of miles away, Captain Daniel Hayes sat in a quieter room, one that lacked the scale and weight of Berlin's command center. His desk was simple, wood-worn smooth by use. A single lamp casting a steady circle of light. Papers stacked neatly. He adjusted his chair slightly, the faint creak barely audible, and read the same kind of report Falken held. Different source. Same conclusion. Britain still held. Hayes leaned back, just a fraction, not in relief, not in surprise, but in observation. He had been tracking the same line for months. Watching for the break everyone expected. Waiting for the moment when pressure would finally produce the result history seemed to guarantee. But it hadn't come. Not after 1 year. Not after 2. Back in Berlin, a junior officer approached Falken and placed another document on the table. "Updated assessment, sir." Falken nodded once. The officer stepped back. Silence returned, the kind that filled space without announcing itself. Falken unfolded the paper slowly. The room continued around him, voices low, controlled, confident in tone but thinner than before. He scanned the lines. Infrastructure strained. Civilian conditions difficult. Resources stretched. And still no collapse. His eyes paused on a single sentence. No measurable decline in national resolve. He read it again. Not because he hadn't understood it, but because he had. The phrasing was careful, clinical, but the meaning carried weight beyond the words. Resolve. Not numbers. Not equipment. Something less tangible. Harder to calculate. Harder to break. Falken set the paper down, but his hand remained on it for a moment longer than necessary. Around him, someone continued explaining projected timelines, how extended pressure would eventually force change. Eventually. The word lingered in the air. Falken looked back at the map. That small island. Still there. Still functioning. Still refusing to follow the expected pattern. In London, far from both rooms, a different kind of quiet existed. Not empty. Not peaceful. But steady. A man stood near a window, looking out at a city that had learned to continue. He held a cup of tea, the steam rising faintly into the cool air. His hands were steady. Not because there was nothing to fear, but because fear had already been accounted for. Life had adjusted. Movement continued. Routine held. Not perfectly. Not easily. But consistently. Back in Berlin, Falken exhaled slowly. Not frustration. Not disbelief. Something closer to recalibration. He reached for a pencil, then stopped before it touched the paper. For a brief second, his reflection appeared faintly in the polished surface of the map table. Still. Unmoving. He set the pencil down instead. Across the room, someone asked a question. No one answered immediately. The delay was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Hayes turned another page. Same pattern. Same outcome. He placed the document down and looked at nothing in particular, just a fixed point beyond the edge of his desk. 2 years. That number carried weight. Not because it was long in absolute terms, but because of what it represented. Expectation unmet. Pressure without result. A system refusing to behave as predicted. In Berlin, Faulkner finally spoke. His voice even, almost too even. This is no longer following the model. The room quieted. Not abruptly. Gradually. As if each person needed a second to process not the words, but the shift behind them. Faulkner didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked again at the island across the narrow stretch of water. Still there. Still holding. No declaration had been made. No admission written down. But something had changed. Not on the map. Not in the reports. In the space between certainty and reality. And in that space, for the first time, no one rushed to fill the silence. Certainty does not disappear all at once. It thins. The room in Berlin did not change in appearance, but something inside it had shifted, something subtle enough that no one could point to it directly, yet strong enough that everyone felt it in the pauses between words. General Erich Faulkner remained standing near the map, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, but his attention had moved away from the colored lines and towards something less visible, something harder to define. The conversation resumed, but it no longer carried the same weight. Voices continued to discuss timelines, projections, expected outcomes. Yet each statement now seemed to require an extra second before it settled, as if the air itself was testing its truth. Faulkner reached again for the report, this time not to read it, but to feel its presence in his hand, the texture of paper, the quiet evidence of something that refused to align with expectation. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes adjusted the angle of his desk lamp by a fraction of an inch. The light shifted slightly across the page, revealing details that had always been there, but now seemed more deliberate. He traced a line with his eyes, not the numbers, not the locations, but the pattern beneath them. Consistency. That was the word that stayed with him. Not strength in the traditional sense. Not overwhelming force. Just the refusal to stop. He tapped the edge of the document once, a soft, almost absent gesture, then let his hand rest still. In London, the rhythm of the city continued in ways that could not be captured in reports. A bus moved slowly down a narrow street. A shopkeeper adjusted items in a window. A woman folded a newspaper and placed it beside her. As she took a sip from a cup that had cooled just enough to hold comfortably. None of these actions carried significance on their own. But together, they formed something larger, something that did not break under pressure because it was not built to react, but to continue. Back in Berlin, one of the officers cleared his throat, a small sound that drew brief attention. "We maintain advantage," he said, carefully, as if choosing each word with more precision than before. "Sustained pressure will produce results." Faulkner did not interrupt. He allowed the sentence to exist in the room, allowed it to settle, allowed others to hear it fully. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement. The distinction was quiet, but it mattered. He turned slightly, his gaze moving from the map to the window across the room. The glass reflected only faint shapes, outlines of uniforms, the suggestion of movement. Beyond it, the sky remained unchanged, pale and distant. Hayes leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the desk. He read the final line of the report one more time, slower now, as if the pacing itself could reveal something new. No measurable decline in national resolve. He repeated the phrase silently. Not measurable. That was the part that held his attention. Because what could not be measured could not be predicted in the same way. It did not follow charts. It did not respond to pressure with expected outcomes. It simply remained. He reached for a pencil, wrote a single note in the margin, then stopped. The word he had written was not analytical. It was not technical. It was simple. Endurance. He set the pencil down and did not add anything else. In Berlin, Faulkner returned his attention to the table. He placed the report flat, smoothing it once with his palm. The motion was controlled, almost habitual, yet it carried a quiet finality. Around him, the discussion had slowed. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because each statement now carried the weight of uncertainty it had not carried before. One officer began to speak again, then paused midway through his thought, as if reconsidering not the words, but the assumption behind them. Faulkner noticed. He did not react outwardly. But he registered the hesitation. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And once it appeared, it could not be removed. In London, the same man by the window placed his empty cup down and reached for his coat. He moved without urgency, without hesitation. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of a city that had learned to absorb disruption without losing its shape. He stepped into the street and joined the flow of movement, one among many, each carrying on in ways that did not announce themselves, yet collectively defined something unbreakable. Hayes closed the file. The sound was soft, but distinct enough to mark an ending. He did not immediately reach for another document. Instead, he sat for a moment, his gaze resting on the closed folder, as if acknowledging that what he had just read was not simply information, but evidence of a pattern that no longer fit within the expected framework. He leaned back slightly, the chair responding with a faint creak, and exhaled. Not relief, not tension, just recognition. Back in Berlin, Falken finally moved away from the map. Not far, just a step. But it was enough to change his perspective, enough to see the room not as a place of certainty, but as a place adjusting to something it had not anticipated. He folded his hands behind his back again, the same posture he had held before, yet now it carried a different meaning. He spoke, his voice steady, measured, almost quiet enough that the room leaned toward it. We assumed isolation would weaken them. He paused, not for effect, but because the next thought required precision. It has not. No one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, not because they agreed, but because the statement did not invite argument. It simply existed. And in its simplicity, it carried more weight than the projections that had filled the room before. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recalculation, of unspoken adjustments, of a realization that did not need to be declared to be understood. Across the ocean, Hayes stood up, gathered the papers, and placed them carefully in order. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He turned off the lamp, and the room dimmed, leaving only the faint outline of objects in low light. As he stepped away from the desk, he did not look back. Some conclusions did not require repetition. In Berlin, the room remained. The map remained. The plans remained. But something else had entered, something that could not be drawn or pinned or measured. A quiet understanding that persistence, when sustained beyond expectation, changes not just outcomes, but perception itself. And once perception shifts, it does not easily return to what it was before. The moment a belief stops being spoken out loud is the moment it starts to break. The war room in Berlin felt quieter than before, but not in a way that suggested calm. It was the kind of quiet that followed after certainty had been stretched too far and had not snapped, but had instead bent, slowly, almost imperceptibly. General Erich Falken stood near the long table, no longer studying the map as closely as he once had. The colored lines remained unchanged, but they no longer held the same authority over the room. Around him, officers moved through their responsibilities with discipline, reviewing updates, exchanging information, maintaining the structure that had defined their work for years. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath it all. The language had changed. Words like inevitable and certain had disappeared, replaced by terms that carried less weight, more caution. Sustained. Ongoing. Unresolved. Falken noticed this without needing to point it out. He noticed it in the way sentences ended slightly earlier than before, in the way no one rushed to fill pauses that once would have been quickly covered with confident projections. He turned toward the map again, but this time his eyes did not follow the borders. They rested instead on the empty space surrounding the island. 21 miles of water. That distance had once seemed insignificant. Now it felt like something else entirely. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood by a narrow window, his hands resting lightly against the frame. Outside, the sky was clear, the light steady, the kind of morning that carried no sign of urgency. He had finished reading the latest reports hours ago, yet the words remained with him, not as data, but as something closer to a question. He had seen patterns before. He had studied how pressure worked, how systems responded, how outcomes formed when variables aligned. But this was different. This did not align. This continued. He stepped back from the window and returned to his desk, not to read again, but to sit. The chair shifted softly beneath him. He placed his hands flat on the surface, feeling the grain of the wood, grounding himself in something physical, something measurable, because what he had been reading was not. In London, the rhythm of the city carried on in ways that had become almost invisible to those within it. A train arrived on schedule. A man checked his watch, adjusted his coat, and stepped forward with the rest of the passengers. A woman opened a small shop, arranging items in the window with careful attention, as if the act itself mattered beyond its purpose. There was no announcement of endurance, no declaration of strength, just continuation. Back in Berlin, a new report was placed in front of Falken. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he let it sit there, allowing the presence of it to register before engaging with it. When he finally picked it up, he read it slowly, not because the content required effort, but because the meaning behind it demanded space. The numbers were consistent. The infrastructure remained functional. Communication lines intact. Public order maintained. He paused at the final section. No change in posture. No indication of withdrawal. Falken lowered the paper slightly, his eyes unfocused for a brief moment, not from distraction, but from recognition. Around the room, movement continued, but more quietly now, as if each person had become aware of the same thing at the same time without speaking it aloud. One officer began to outline a revised approach, his tone careful, measured, avoiding any language that implied certainty. Falken listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. But when the officer finished, Falken did not respond immediately. The pause stretched, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to be felt. Then he spoke. "We have been measuring the wrong variable." The words were simple, delivered without emphasis, but they settled into the room with a weight that redirected attention. No one asked him to clarify. No one needed to, because each person understood, in their own way, what had been overlooked. Across the ocean, Hayes reached for the same file again, not to review the details, but to confirm the pattern. He flipped through the pages, his movements precise, controlled. The repetition was there, not in the numbers themselves, but in the absence of decline. He stopped at the final page and closed the folder gently. The sound was soft, but it marked something final. He leaned back, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling, not searching for answers, but acknowledging that some questions no longer required them. In London, the man who had stepped onto the street earlier now returned home. He removed his coat, placed it carefully on a chair, and sat down. The room was quiet, filled with the small, familiar details of daily life. A clock ticked steadily on the wall. He glanced at it briefly, then looked away. Time was moving forward. That was enough. Back in Berlin, Falken placed the report back on the table, aligning it neatly with the others. He stepped away from the map again, this time not out of habit, but by choice. The map still represented control, still displayed progress, still served its purpose. But it no longer defined the full reality. He walked slowly toward the window, stopping just short of it. The glass reflected his outline, faint but present. He studied it for a moment, not his appearance, but the stillness of it. Then he spoke again, quieter this time, not addressing the room, but allowing the words to exist within it. If they have not stopped by now, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to, because the conclusion did not belong to him alone. It belonged to everyone in the room. And as the silence settled once more, it carried a different weight than before. Not uncertainty, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that does not demand agreement, but changes perception permanently. Across the ocean, Hayes stood, gathered the files, and placed them aside. His movements were deliberate, almost ritual. He turned off the light, and the room dimmed, leaving only the faint outline of what remained. As he stepped away, he did not carry the reports with him. He did not need to. The pattern had already been understood, and once understood, it did not require repetition. In Berlin, the room remained. The structure remained. The plans remained. But something else had taken root, something that could not be measured, could not be projected, could not be forced into a model. A quiet shift. A recognition that endurance, when it extends beyond expectation, does not just resist pressure. It redefines it. And in that redefinition, the outcome is no longer the only thing that changes. Respect does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, and once it does, it changes everything. The war room in Berlin no longer carried the same rhythm it once had. Nothing visible had been removed, nothing formally altered, yet the atmosphere had shifted into something more restrained, more deliberate. General Eric Falcon stood near the window now more often than the map, not because the map had lost importance, but because it no longer held all the answers it once promised. The officers around him continued their work with discipline, reviewing documents, adjusting plans, maintaining order in structure and tone. But the confidence that once filled every sentence had softened. It had not disappeared. It had matured into something quieter. Falcon held a new report in his hands, the paper still crisp, the ink precise, but the meaning behind it familiar now in a way that did not require urgency. He read the lines without haste. No significant change. No collapse. No signal of withdrawal. He lowered the paper slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the light remained steady and indifferent to the calculations inside the room. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes sat at his desk once more, but this time he did not open the file immediately. He rested his hand on top of it, feeling its presence rather than its contents. He already knew what it would say. The pattern had become consistent enough that the details no longer surprised him. What held his attention now was not what changed, but what did not. He finally opened the folder, not searching, but confirming. The lines read the same. The structure held. The absence of decline remained. He nodded once, not to anyone in particular, but as an acknowledgement of something that had moved beyond analysis. In London, the same quiet persistence continued. A man stood in line at a small shop, adjusting his hat as he waited his turn. A woman stepped aside to let another pass, offering a brief nod, a small gesture that carried no significance on its own, yet reflected something deeper in its simplicity. Life continued not as a reaction, but as a decision made again and again without announcement. Back in Berlin, Falcon placed the report down on the table, aligning it with the others. He did not stack it immediately. Instead, he left it slightly apart, as if allowing it to stand on its own for a moment. One of the officers approached, offering a revised projection, his tone respectful, measured, free of the sharp certainty that once defined these discussions. Falcon listened fully, his attention steady, his expression unchanged. When the officer finished, Falcon remained silent for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but because the response he would give no longer needed to be immediate. He stepped forward, resting his fingertips lightly against the edge of the table. "We have accounted for resources," he said, his voice calm, even. "We have accounted for geography. We have accounted for time." He paused, not for emphasis, but because the final part required clarity. "We did not account for this." He did not need to define what this was. The room understood, not in identical terms, but in shared recognition. Across the ocean, Hayes closed the folder once more, but this time he did not set it aside immediately. He held it for a moment longer, as if weighing it, not physically, but conceptually. Then he placed it down and stood. He moved toward the window again, looking out at a horizon that remained unchanged, steady, indifferent to the patterns being observed across thousands of miles. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not release tension, but acknowledges presence. In London, the man who had been waiting in line stepped outside, a small package in his hand. He paused for a moment, looking down the street, then continued walking, his pace unhurried, his posture steady. There was no performance in his movement, no declaration, just continuation. Back in Berlin, the room had grown quieter once more, but this silence was different from the earlier ones. It was not filled with recalculation. It was filled with understanding. Falcon straightened slightly, his hands returning behind his back, his posture familiar, yet now carrying a different weight. He looked once more at the map, not to study it, but to acknowledge it. It still represented control. It still displayed reach. But it no longer represented certainty. He turned away from it again, this time without hesitation. "We can continue to measure everything we see," he said, his voice low but clear. "But what matters here is what does not change." No one interrupted. No one questioned. Because the statement did not challenge their knowledge. It expanded it. Across the Atlantic, Hayes remained at the window, his gaze steady, his expression neutral, yet his understanding complete. He no longer needed to compare reports. He no longer needed to verify patterns. The conclusion had formed on its own, through repetition, through consistency, through the absence of what had been expected. He turned away from the window and reached for his coat, not in urgency, but in routine. The day continued. In London, The same rhythm carried forward. A door opened. A light turned on. A voice spoke quietly from one room to another. Small actions. Unremarkable. Yet together, they formed something that had already been recognized elsewhere, in rooms far removed from their origin. Back in Berlin, Faulkner remained still for a moment longer, then spoke once more, quieter than before, not addressing the room, but allowing the words to exist within it. They are not holding because they can win. He paused, his eyes steady. They are holding because they refuse to stop. The distinction settled into the space around him, not as a conclusion, but as a realization that no longer required debate. And in that moment, without announcement, without ceremony, respect had taken its place. Not declared, not recorded, but understood. And once understood, it did not leave. Some realizations do not change what you do next. They change how you understand everything you have already done. The war room in Berlin had returned to its routines, but the routines themselves had become more deliberate, more restrained, as if each action now carried an awareness that had not been present before. General Erich Faulkner stood once again near the table, the reports arranged with precision, the map still stretched across the wall, unchanged in its form, yet altered in its meaning. The officers continued their work, voices steady, movements controlled, but the tone had shifted into something quieter, something that no longer needed to assert confidence because it had already begun to question it. Faulkner picked up the latest report without urgency. The paper felt familiar in his hands, the weight unchanged, yet the significance of its contents no longer required anticipation. He read slowly, not searching for surprises, but confirming what had already become a pattern. No collapse, no withdrawal, no indication of surrender. He reached the final line and paused, not because the words were new, but because their repetition had become the message itself. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood outside for the first time that morning, the air cool against his face, the sky stretching wide above him without interruption. He held no documents now, no reports, no measurements. He did not need them. The pattern had already settled into something that no longer required verification. He walked a few steps forward, hands in his coat pockets, his pace unhurried, his attention not fixed on any single point, but open to the stillness around him. In London, the same quiet persistence continued. A child walked beside his father, their steps uneven but steady, their conversation soft, almost lost in the rhythm of the street. A woman opened her door and stepped outside, pausing briefly as if to measure the day before continuing. None of them spoke of endurance. None of them needed to. It was already present in everything they did. Back in Berlin, Faulkner placed the report down and finally stacked it with the others, aligning it carefully, as if the act itself marked a conclusion that did not need to be spoken aloud. One of the officers approached again, presenting a new assessment, his tone respectful, measured, free of assumption. Faulkner listened without interruption, his attention complete, his posture unchanged. When the officer finished, Faulkner did not respond immediately. The pause that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding that no longer required discussion. He looked once more at the map, his eyes tracing not the lines of control, but the space that had resisted them. "We have been asking when they will stop," he said quietly. The room stilled, not in reaction, but in recognition. He continued, his voice steady. "That may no longer be the question." No one asked what the new question was, because each person in the room had already begun to understand it in their own way. Across the ocean, Hayes stopped walking and looked out across the open horizon. He did not think in terms of outcomes anymore. Not in the way he once had. The reports had shown him something else, something that did not fit into the structure of predictions. He spoke softly, not to anyone, but to the space around him. "They are not waiting for the end." The words carried no emphasis, no dramatic weight, but they settled into his understanding with clarity. He turned and began walking again, his pace unchanged, his direction steady. In London, the day continued. A clock struck. The hour. A door closed gently. A light flickered on inside a small room. Each moment ordinary. Each moment part of something larger that had already been recognized far beyond its borders. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stepped away from the table, moving slowly toward the window once more. He stopped just short of it, his reflection faint in the glass, his posture still, composed, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that stillness, something had settled into place. Not doubt, not fear, something quieter, something more precise. He spoke again, this time not to direct, not to instruct, but to acknowledge. They have already decided. The room remained silent. No one asked what he meant, because the meaning did not need explanation. The decision had been made long before this moment, long before the reports, long before the projections. It was not a decision that appeared in documents or strategies. It was something else, something that did not reverse when pressure increased, something that did not weaken when isolated. Across the ocean, Hayes reached the edge of the path and paused, looking out once more. He did not need to return to the reports. He did not need to confirm anything further. The conclusion was already complete. He exhaled slowly, then continued forward. In London, the same quiet rhythm held. The man who had returned home earlier now sat by a small table, a book open in front of him, his attention steady, his posture relaxed. Outside, the street carried on, each step, each movement, each moment reinforcing something that had already been understood elsewhere. Back in Berlin, Fokken remained at the window for a moment longer, then turned away. He walked back toward the table, his movements deliberate, his expression unchanged. The map was still there. The reports were still there. The plans were still in motion. But none of them held the same meaning they once had. He placed his hand lightly on the table and spoke one final time, his voice quiet, almost indistinguishable from the silence around it. Then we must understand what that means. The words did not demand action. They did not change the plans already in place. But they marked something else. A shift not in strategy, but in perception. And once perception changes, it does not return to what it was before. The room remained still, the silence no longer uncertain, no longer searching. It had found something, not an answer, something deeper. And in that stillness, without announcement, without declaration, the understanding was complete. There is a point where observation becomes acceptance, and acceptance becomes something heavier than strategy. The war room in Berlin no longer felt like a place where outcomes were decided. It felt like a place where outcomes were being understood after they had already taken shape elsewhere. General Erich Fokken stood at the center of the room, not commanding attention, not directing movement, but present in a way that anchored the silence around him. The map remained fixed on the wall, its colors unchanged, its lines still sharp, but it had lost its authority as the sole representation of reality. It no longer told the full story. The officers continued their work, reviewing updates, adjusting details, maintaining the structure that defined their roles. But something fundamental had shifted. They no longer spoke to convince. They spoke to clarify. Fokken picked up another report, though he already knew its conclusion. He read it anyway, slowly, allowing each line to pass without resistance. No collapse, no withdrawal, no indication of change. He lowered the paper and did not place it down immediately. Instead, he held it, as if measuring not its weight, but the consistency it represented. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes had returned indoors, the door closing softly behind him. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that did not demand attention but held it. He removed his coat and placed it over the back of the chair, his movements unhurried, precise. He did not reach for the reports. He did not need to. The information they contained had already become part of something larger in his understanding. He walked to the desk and rested his hand lightly on its surface, feeling the familiar texture, grounding himself again in something that could be touched, something that did not shift. In London, the same quiet persistence continued, unchanged and unannounced. A woman placed a kettle on the stove, waiting without impatience as the water warmed. A man adjusted a picture frame slightly on the wall, aligning it with care, as if precision in small things mattered. A child sat near a window, watching the street below, his expression calm, observant, untroubled by what others might have expected him to fear. None of them were aware of the rooms. Far away where their actions were being studied, interpreted, understood. They did not need to be. Back in Berlin, Fokken finally set the report down, placing it on top of the others with deliberate alignment. He stepped back, not from the table, but from the idea that the table itself contained all necessary answers. One of the officers began to speak, outlining a continued approach, his voice steady, controlled, careful not to overreach. Fokken listened fully, his attention focused, his posture unchanged. When the officer finished, Falcon did not respond immediately. The pause that followed was not hesitation. It was space. Space for the words to settle, for their meaning to be fully realized. Then he spoke, his voice calm, almost quiet enough that the room leaned toward it. We are not facing resistance in the way we defined it. The statement was simple. It did not challenge. It did not argue. It clarified. No one asked for further explanation, because each person in the room had already begun to see it. Resistance implied a reaction. This was something else. Something that did not bend in response, but remained steady regardless of pressure. Across the ocean, Hayes moved to the window again, though he did not look out immediately. He paused, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes focused somewhere between reflection and distance. He spoke softly, not to be heard, but to give shape to a thought that had already formed. They are not holding the line. He paused briefly, then finished the thought. They are the line. The distinction settled into his understanding with clarity. It was no longer about endurance as a temporary state. It was about identity, something that did not shift because it was not reacting. It was simply continuing to be what it was. In London, the man by the small table turned a page in his book, the sound soft, steady, unremarkable. Outside, footsteps passed along the street, conversations low, movement continuous. Life did not pause to reflect on itself. It moved forward because that was what it did. Back in Berlin, Falcon turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not to inspect, but to observe. He saw the same discipline, the same structure, the same attention to detail that had always defined the room. But now he also saw something else. A quiet recognition that had settled into each person without being spoken. He stepped toward the window once more, stopping at the same distance as before. The glass reflected the room faintly, blending inside and outside into a single, indistinct image. He spoke again, his voice lower, more contained. This does not end when we expect it to. He did not elaborate. He did not need to, because the implication was already understood. Expectations had been built on patterns that no longer applied. And when patterns no longer apply, time itself becomes uncertain. Across the Atlantic, Hayes exhaled slowly, then stepped back from the window. He returned to the desk and finally reached for the reports, not to study them again, but to gather them. He stacked them carefully, aligning the edges, creating order in something that had already revealed its meaning. He placed the stack to one side and left it there. He would not return to it immediately. There was no need. In London, the kettle began to whistle softly, the sound rising just enough to draw attention. The woman lifted it from the stove and poured the water, the motion steady, practiced. Steam rose briefly, then faded. The moment passed, and the rhythm continued. Back in Berlin, Falcon remained still for a moment longer, then turned away from the window. He walked back toward the table, his movements deliberate, his expression unchanged. The room remained structured, controlled, disciplined. But beneath that structure, something had shifted permanently. He placed his hand lightly on the table once more and spoke, his voice quiet, measured, final in a way that did not require emphasis. Then this is not about breaking them. He paused, allowing the thought to complete itself in the minds of those listening. It is about understanding that they do not break. The silence that followed was complete. Not empty, not uncertain, complete. Because in that moment, the realization had fully settled. Not as a strategy, not as a conclusion, but as a truth that no longer required confirmation. And once something becomes that clear, it does not change. It simply remains. Some truths do not arrive with force. They arrive quietly, and once they do, they cannot be undone. The war room in Berlin had become a place where words were chosen more carefully, not because of fear, but because clarity had replaced assumption. General Erich Falcon stood at the same table, yet he no longer used it as a place to define outcomes. It had become a place to observe them. The map still stretched across the wall, its edges sharp, its colors precise, but it no longer carried the same authority. It showed control, but it did not explain endurance. Around him, the officers continued their work, their discipline unchanged, their structure intact, but their tone had shifted into something quieter, something that did not need to assert dominance because it had already begun to recognize limits. Falcon picked up a report, though he no longer expected it to tell him anything new. He read it slowly, his eyes moving across the lines with measured attention. The pattern remained. No collapse, no withdrawal, no change in direction. He reached the final line and paused, not because it surprised him, but because its repetition had become the message itself. He lowered the paper and placed it down without urgency. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes sat at his desk again, but the room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because his understanding had settled into something complete. He opened the file one more time, not to search, not to analyze, but to confirm what he already knew. The words did not shift. The pattern did not break. He closed the folder gently, the sound soft but final. He did not place it aside immediately. Instead, he rested his hand on it, as if acknowledging that what it represented had moved beyond documentation. In London, the quiet rhythm continued, unchanged and unannounced. A man walked down a narrow street, his steps steady, his attention forward. A woman paused at a doorway, adjusting her coat before stepping outside. A light turned on in a small room, illuminating a space that held nothing extraordinary, yet everything essential. These moments did not declare strength. They did not need to. They were the expression of something already decided. Back in Berlin, Falken stepped away from the table and moved toward the map once more, but this time he did not study it. He simply looked at it, acknowledging it for what it was and what it was not. It represented reach. It represented movement. But it did not represent the thing that had refused to yield. He turned away from it again, this time more quickly, as if the answer no longer existed there. One of the officers approached, offering another structured update, his tone precise, careful, free of overstatement. Falken listened without interruption, his posture still, his attention complete. When the officer finished, Falken did not respond immediately. The pause stretched slightly longer than before, not out of hesitation, but because the response no longer needed to be immediate. He spoke quietly, his voice even, controlled. We have continued to expect a change. He paused, then continued. There has been none. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any projection that had come before. No one argued. No one attempted to reframe it, because the truth of it had already settled into the room. Across the ocean, Hayes stood and walked slowly toward the window, his movements unhurried, his expression unchanged. He looked out at the horizon, not searching for anything new, but acknowledging that what he had been observing was no longer a question. It had become an answer. He spoke softly, his voice barely above a breath. They are not waiting for an opportunity. He paused briefly. They are continuing without one. The distinction settled into place with clarity. It removed the expectation that something external would change the outcome. It revealed that the outcome had already been shaped by something internal, something that did not depend on circumstance. In London, the same quiet continuation held. The man who had been walking reached his destination and stopped, his hand resting briefly on the door before he opened it. Inside, the space was simple, familiar, unchanged. He stepped in without hesitation. Life did not pause to measure itself. It moved forward because it had already decided to. Back in Berlin, Falken moved toward the window once more, stopping at the same distance as before. The glass reflected the room faintly, blending the inside with the outside, the controlled with the unknown. He looked at his reflection for a moment, not studying it, but acknowledging it. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, more contained. If they have not changed by now. He paused, not because he did not know how to finish the sentence, but because the ending no longer required words. The room understood, because the conclusion did not belong to a single voice. It had formed collectively, through repetition, through consistency, through the absence of what had once been expected. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and returned to the desk. He did not reach for the reports again. He did not need to. He placed both hands on the surface of the desk and stood still for a moment, grounding himself in something physical, something stable. Then he spoke quietly, not to anyone, but to the understanding that had settled within him. Then it will not be changed. The words carried no emphasis, no dramatic tone. They did not need to, because they did not describe a possibility. They described a realization. In London, the same quiet persistence continued, uninterrupted, unannounced. A clock moved forward 1 second at a time. A door opened and closed. A voice spoke softly from one room to another. These moments did not stand out. They did not need to. They were the foundation of something that had already been recognized far beyond their reach. Back in Berlin, Falken turned away from the window and walked back toward the table, his movements deliberate, his posture steady. The room remained structured, controlled, disciplined. But beneath that structure, something had settled permanently. He placed his hand lightly on the table and spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, complete. Then we are not watching them endure. He paused, allowing the thought to fully form in the silence. We are watching them remain. The silence that followed did not ask for confirmation. It did not require agreement. It simply held the truth as it was. And once it was seen clearly, it did not change. It stayed exactly where it was, steady, unbroken, and understood. There comes a moment when observation stops being external and becomes something you carry with you. The war room in Berlin no longer felt like a place where questions were being asked. It had become a place where answers had quietly settled, not written down, not formally declared, but understood in a way that did not require repetition. General Erich Falken stood near the table, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, yet the way he occupied the space had shifted. He was no longer searching for confirmation. He was no longer waiting for change. He was recognizing something that had already proven itself beyond expectation. The map remained on the wall, its lines still precise, its colors still sharp, but it had lost its final authority. It showed movement. It showed reach. But it did not show the one thing that had remained constant. Falken did not look at it for long. He did not need to. Around him, the officers continued their work, their discipline intact, their voices measured, but their words now carried a different weight. They no longer projected certainty. They acknowledged reality. Falken picked up a report, though he already knew what it would contain. He read it slowly, not because the information was complex, but because the repetition had become meaningful in itself. No collapse, no withdrawal, no shift in direction. He reached the final line and paused, allowing the words to settle once more. Then he placed the report down, not on top of the others, but beside them, as if giving it its own space, its own acknowledgement. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the same room, but his attention had moved beyond the desk, beyond the reports, beyond the need to analyze. He walked slowly across the floor, his steps quiet, his movements deliberate. He stopped near the window, but he did not look out immediately. Instead, he rested his hand lightly against the frame, grounding himself in something steady. He had read enough. He had observed enough. The pattern had already formed. In London, the quiet continuation held, unchanged and unannounced. A man adjusted his coat as he stepped outside, his breath visible briefly in the cool air before fading. A woman arranged items on a small table, aligning them with care, her movements steady, unhurried. A light turned off in one room and on in another, the rhythm of daily life continuing without interruption. None of these moments declared anything. They did not need to. They were the declaration. Back in Berlin, Falken stepped away from the table and moved toward the window once more. He stopped at the same place, the glass reflecting the room faintly, blending the controlled environment with the unknown beyond it. He looked at his reflection for a moment, not examining it, but acknowledging its presence. Then he spoke, his voice low, measured, almost quiet enough to disappear into the space around him. We have been watching for an end. He paused, not for emphasis, but because the next part required precision. There has been no sign of one. The statement did not challenge. It did not provoke. It clarified. No one in the room responded immediately. They did not need to, because the truth of it had already settled into each of them. Across the ocean, Hayes finally turned his gaze outward, looking across a horizon that remained steady, unchanged, unaffected by the conclusions forming in distant rooms. He spoke softly, his voice barely above a breath. It is not temporary. The words were simple, but they carried weight. They removed the idea that what had been observed would eventually shift, that time alone would produce change. They recognized something else, something that did not rely on time to prove itself. In London, the same quiet rhythm continued. The man who had stepped outside now walked down the street, his pace steady, his attention forward. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. His movement was not driven by urgency. It was driven by continuity. Back in Berlin, Faucon turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the table. His movements were deliberate, his posture unchanged, but his understanding had settled into something complete. He placed his hand lightly on the surface of the table, feeling the solid structure beneath it. Something stable, something that did not shift. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, even. Then we must stop expecting it to end the way we predicted. The words carried no emphasis, no dramatic tone. They did not need to, because they did not suggest a possibility. They acknowledged a reality. One of the officers shifted slightly, as if preparing to respond, then stopped. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it reflected something larger. There was nothing to add, nothing to correct. The conclusion had already formed. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and returned to the desk, but he did not sit. He stood there, his hands resting lightly against the surface, his gaze steady. He did not reach for the reports again. He did not need to. He spoke quietly, not to anyone, but to the understanding that had already taken shape. They are not continuing because they must. He paused briefly. They are continuing because they chose to. The distinction settled into place with clarity. It removed the idea of obligation. It revealed something deeper, something that could not be forced or measured. In London, the same quiet persistence held. A door opened. A voice spoke softly. A clock moved forward 1 second at a time. These moments did not stand out. They did not need to. They were the foundation of something that had already been recognized far beyond their origin. Back in Berlin, Faucon remained still for a moment longer, then stepped back from the table. He looked once more at the map, not to study it, but to acknowledge it. It still represented control. It still displayed reach. But it no longer defined the outcome. He turned away from it without hesitation. Then this is not about what we will do next, he said quietly. He paused, allowing the thought to settle. It is about what we now understand. The silence that followed was complete. Not empty, not uncertain, complete. Because in that moment, the realization had fully settled into the room. Not as a strategy, not as a projection, but as something final. Something that did not require confirmation. And once something is understood that clearly, it does not change. It remains exactly as it is. Quiet, steady, and undeniable. When a truth becomes clear enough, it stops being discussed and starts being carried. The war room in Berlin had reached that point. No one announced it. No one marked the moment. But it was there, present in the way voices had softened, in the way pauses were no longer filled, in the way certainty had been replaced not by doubt, but by something more precise. General Erich Faucon stood near the center of the room, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, yet the way he engaged with the space had shifted completely. He no longer looked for confirmation in the reports. He no longer expected the map to reveal what would happen next. He had begun to understand something else entirely. The map still hung on the wall, its lines exact, its colors unmoved, but it now felt like a record of movement, not a prediction of outcome. Faucon glanced at it briefly, then turned away. It no longer held his attention for long. Around him, the officers continued their work, but their conversations had become quieter, more deliberate. They no longer spoke in projections. They spoke in observations. Faucon reached for another report, not out of necessity, but out of habit. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the lines with calm precision. The words were familiar now. No collapse. No withdrawal. No measurable decline. He reached the end and paused, letting the repetition settle once more. Then he folded the paper carefully and placed it down, not with the others, but slightly apart, as if acknowledging that it was no longer just information. It was confirmation of something that had already been understood. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood in silence, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He had not returned to the reports. He had not needed to. The pattern had moved beyond documentation. It had become something internal, something that shaped how he saw everything else. He walked slowly toward the window again, his steps measured, his movements controlled. He stopped just before the glass, his reflection faint in the surface, blending with the horizon beyond. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the stillness to exist. In London, the rhythm of the city continued without interruption. A man opened a door and stepped into the street, pausing briefly before moving forward. A woman adjusted a small clock on a shelf, aligning it with quiet care. A light flickered on in a narrow room, illuminating a space that held nothing remarkable, yet everything essential. These moments did not declare strength. They did not need to. They were the result of something already decided. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stepped away from the table and moved once more toward the window. The distance was the same as before, the reflection unchanged, but his understanding had settled deeper. He spoke quietly, his voice even, controlled. We have reached a point where the outcome is no longer defined by pressure. The words did not carry force. They did not need to. They carried clarity. No one responded immediately. The room did not resist the statement. It absorbed it. Across the ocean, Hayes finally spoke, his voice soft, almost lost in the space around him. They are not responding anymore. He paused, then finished the thought. They are simply continuing. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. It removed the expectation that action would produce reaction. It revealed something else. Something that existed independently of what was applied to it. In London, the same quiet persistence held. The man who had stepped outside now walked steadily down the street, his pace unbroken, his attention forward. He did not look for signs. He did not wait for change. He moved because that was what he had chosen to do. Back in Berlin, Faulkner turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not to inspect, but to recognize. He saw the same discipline, the same structure, the same attention to detail. But now he also saw something else. A shared understanding that had settled into each person without being spoken aloud. He stepped away from the window and returned to the table, placing his hand lightly against its surface. The wood felt solid beneath his fingers, unchanged, stable. He spoke again, his voice calm, measured. Then we are not influencing their direction. He paused briefly. We are observing it. The words settled into the room with quiet weight. No one challenged them. No one attempted to reframe them. Because the truth of them had already become clear. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and stood still for a moment, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. He no longer needed to confirm anything. The understanding had already formed. He spoke again, quietly, almost as if finishing a thought that had been building for some time. And it is not changing. In London, the same rhythm continued. A door closed gently. A voice spoke from one room to another. A clock moved forward 1 second at a time. These moments did not stand out. They did not need to. They were the foundation of something that had already been recognized far beyond their reach. Back in Berlin, Faulkner remained at the table, his hand still resting lightly against it. He looked once more at the map, not to study it, but to acknowledge it. It still represented movement. It still displayed reach. But it no longer defined the outcome. He turned away from it again, this time without hesitation. Then this is no longer about what we expected to happen, he said quietly. He paused, allowing the thought to settle fully. It is about what has already been proven. The silence that followed was complete. Not empty. Not uncertain. Complete. Because in that moment, the realization had moved beyond discussion. It had become something else. Something carried, not spoken. Something understood, not debated. And once something reaches that point, it does not change. It remains exactly as it is. Quiet, steady, and undeniable. There is a final stage to understanding, and it is not loud. It is the moment when nothing needs to be added. The war room in Berlin had reached that stage. No one announced it. No one marked it as a turning point. But it was there, present in the way every movement had become more deliberate, in the way every word carried weight not from force, but from restraint. General Erich Faulkner stood at the table, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the purpose of his presence had shifted. He was no longer there to predict. He was there to acknowledge. The map still covered the wall, its structure intact, its colors unchanged, but it had lost its final authority. It no longer answered the question that mattered most. Faulkner did not look at it for long. He no longer needed to. Around him, the officers continued their work, their discipline precise, their tone controlled, but the nature of their conversations had changed completely. They were no longer building arguments. They were refining understanding. Faulkner reached for a report, though the motion felt almost symbolic now. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the lines with calm familiarity. No collapse, no withdrawal, no measurable shift. He reached the end and did not pause this time. He folded the paper once and placed it down, aligning it with the others in a single, clean motion. The repetition had become complete. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood still in his room, the light from the window casting a quiet outline across the floor. He had not opened a report in hours. He had not needed to. The pattern had moved beyond analysis. It had become something that shaped how he understood everything else. He walked slowly to the window and rested his hand against the frame, his gaze steady, his expression neutral. He spoke softly, not to be heard, but to give shape to something that had already settled within him. It does not depend on what happens next. The words carried no emphasis. They did not need to. They were not a conclusion. They were a recognition. In London, the quiet rhythm continued without interruption. A man stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a gentle motion. A woman adjusted a curtain slightly, letting in just enough light to fill the room. A child sat near a small table, tracing lines across a piece of paper, his attention steady, his movements calm. These moments did not declare resilience. They did not need to. They were its proof. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stepped away from the table and moved once more toward the window. The distance was familiar now, the reflection unchanged, but the meaning had settled deeper. He looked out, though there was nothing specific to see. The sky remained distant, indifferent. He spoke quietly, his voice even, controlled. We have been measuring progress. He paused briefly, then continued. This is not progress. The distinction was clear. Progress implied movement toward an end. This was something else. Something that existed without requiring conclusion. No one in the room responded. They did not need to. Because the statement did not invite discussion. It closed it. Across the ocean, Hayes stepped back from the window and turned slowly, his movements unhurried, his posture relaxed. He no longer needed to confirm anything. He no longer needed to compare outcomes. The understanding had already taken its final form. He spoke again, quietly, almost as if finishing a thought that had been forming over time. It is already decided. The words settled into the silence of the room with quiet certainty. Not as prediction, not as assumption, as recognition. In London, the same steady continuation held. A clock moved forward, second by second, without pause. A door opened and closed. A voice spoke softly, then faded. These moments did not stand out. They did not need to. They were the structure of something that no longer depended on being noticed. Back in Berlin, Faulkner turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the table. His movements were deliberate, his posture steady, but his presence now carried a different kind of weight. Not authority, not control, something quieter, something more precise. He placed his hand lightly on the surface of the table, feeling its solidity, its stillness. Then he spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, complete. Then there is nothing left to wait for. The room did not react. No one moved. No one spoke. Because the statement did not require response. It required acceptance. Across the Atlantic, Hayes remained still for a moment longer, then reached for his coat. He put it on slowly, his movements steady, his expression unchanged. He did not look back at the desk. He did not reach for the reports. He no longer needed them. The understanding had already been carried forward. In London, the man who had stepped outside continued walking, his pace even, his direction clear. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He moved forward because that was what he had chosen to do, long before anyone had begun to observe him. Back in Berlin, Faulkner remained at the table for a moment longer, then removed his hand and stepped back. He looked once more at the map, not to study it, not to interpret it, but to acknowledge it as something that no longer defined the full reality. He turned away without hesitation. The silence that filled the room was no longer searching. It was no longer uncertain. It was complete. Because in that moment, nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be explained. The understanding had reached its final form. And once it does not change. It remains exactly as it is. Quiet, steady, and absolute. After a realization becomes complete, what remains is not reaction, but behavior. The war room in Berlin did not change its structure, its order, or its purpose on the surface, but beneath that surface something had settled into permanence. The conversations had not stopped. The reports had not ceased. The map still occupied its place on the wall. And yet, none of these elements held the same meaning they once had. General Erich Faulkner stood near the table, his posture composed, his presence steady, But he no longer approached the room as a place of calculation. It had become a place of quiet acknowledgement. He reached for a report, not because he needed to, but because the motion itself was part of the routine that remained. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the familiar lines. No collapse, no withdrawal, no measurable change. He reached the end and did not pause. The repetition no longer required reflection. It had already been understood. He folded the paper once and placed it neatly on the table, aligning it with the others in a motion that carried more finality than emphasis. Around him, the officers continued their work, but their tone had shifted into something quieter, something that no longer attempted to define the outcome, but simply recognized it. No one spoke in absolutes anymore. No one reached for certainty, because certainty had already been replaced by something else, something more precise. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes sat at his desk, but the desk no longer held his attention. The reports lay untouched, stacked neatly, their edges aligned. He had not opened them. He did not need to. The pattern they contained had already moved beyond documentation. It had become something internal, something that shaped how he viewed everything else. He leaned back slightly, the chair responding with a soft sound, and allowed the silence of the room to exist without interruption. Then he spoke quietly, not to anyone, but to the understanding that had already settled within him. It does not require reinforcement. The words carried no weight beyond their clarity. They were not an argument. They were not a conclusion. They were recognition. In London, the quiet rhythm of life continued, unchanged and unannounced. A man stepped into a small room and placed his hat on a hook by the door. A woman sat at a table, her hands resting calmly as she looked out a window that reflected the soft light of the afternoon. A child walked slowly along a narrow path, his steps steady, his attention forward. These moments did not present themselves as extraordinary. They did not need to. They were the expression of something that had already been decided, long before anyone had begun to observe it. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stepped away from the table and moved toward the window once more, stopping at the same place, the distance now almost instinctive. The glass reflected the room faintly, blending the stillness inside with the quiet distance outside. He did not look for anything beyond it. He did not expect anything to appear. He spoke quietly, his voice even, controlled. We are no longer waiting for confirmation. The statement did not challenge. It did not provoke. It clarified. No one in the room responded. Because there was nothing to confirm. The understanding had already reached its final form. Across the ocean, Hayes stood and walked slowly toward the window, mirroring the same movement without knowing it. He placed his hand lightly against the frame, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed. He did not look for change. He did not expect it. He spoke softly, almost as if completing a thought that had been forming over time. It has already confirmed itself. The words settled into the silence with quiet precision. In London, the same steady continuation held. A clock moved forward, 1 second at a time. A door opened and closed. A voice spoke softly, then faded. These moments did not demand attention. They did not need to. They were the structure of something that did not rely on recognition to exist. Back in Berlin, Faulkner turned away from the window and walked back toward the table. His movements were deliberate, his posture unchanged, but his presence now carried something different. Not authority, not command, something quieter, something more exact. He placed his hand lightly on the table once more, feeling its solid surface beneath his fingers. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, without emphasis. Then this is not something that can be altered by force. The statement did not require elaboration. It did not invite response, because the meaning had already been understood. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged. He did not return to the desk. He did not reach for the reports. He did not need to. The understanding had already been carried forward. He spoke quietly, his voice steady, almost indistinguishable from the silence around him. It was never about force. The words did not argue. They did not correct. They clarified something that had already become clear. In London, the man who had placed his hat by the door now sat down slowly, his movements unhurried, his posture relaxed. The room around him remained simple, unchanged, filled with the small details of daily life. Nothing in the space suggested anything extraordinary. And yet, Everything within it reflected something that had already been recognized elsewhere. Back in Berlin, Falken remained at the table for a moment longer, then removed his hand and stepped back. He looked once more at the map, not to interpret it, not to question it, but to acknowledge it as something that no longer defined the full reality. He turned away without hesitation. The silence that filled the room was no longer searching. It was no longer uncertain. It was complete, because in that moment, there was nothing left to add, nothing left to prove. The understanding had reached its final state. And once it does not change. It remains exactly as it is. Quiet, steady, and carried forward without resistance. What remains after everything is understood is not silence. It is alignment. The war room in Berlin no longer felt like a place where anything needed to be resolved. It had become something else entirely. A space where understanding had settled so completely that nothing more needed to be added. General Erich Falken stood near the table, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but there was no longer any tension in the room, no expectation waiting to be fulfilled. The map remained where it had always been, its lines sharp, its colors fixed, but it no longer held authority over the room. It had become a reference, not a conclusion. Falken did not look at it. He no longer needed to. Around him, the officers continued their routines, but even those routines had softened. Papers were reviewed. Notes were taken. Movements were precise. Yet everything carried a quieter weight, as if each action now existed within a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. Falken reached for a report, not because it was necessary, but because it was part of the structure that remained. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the lines that had become familiar long ago. No collapse, no withdrawal, no measurable shift. He reached the end and closed the report without pause. The repetition had lost its function as information. It had become confirmation of something already complete. He placed the paper down, aligning it with the others, then let his hand rest there for a moment, as if acknowledging the finality of what it represented. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood in his room, the light from the window stretching across the floor in a quiet, steady line. He had not touched the reports. He had not needed to. The pattern they contained had already moved beyond paper, beyond words, beyond analysis. He walked slowly toward the window, his movements unhurried, his posture relaxed. He placed his hand against the frame and looked outward, not searching, not expecting, but simply observing. He spoke quietly, his voice calm, measured. There is nothing left to interpret. The words did not carry emphasis. They did not need to. They were not a conclusion. They were a recognition of completion. In London, the rhythm of life continued without interruption. A man walked down a narrow street, his steps even, his direction steady. A woman placed a cup on a table, her movements careful, unhurried. A child looked out of a window, his expression calm, his attention fixed. On something simple, something ordinary. These moments did not present themselves as significant. They did not need to. They were the expression of something that had already been recognized elsewhere. Back in Berlin, Falken stepped away from the table and moved toward the window once more, stopping at the same place he had stood before. The reflection in the glass remained faint, blending the room behind him with the distance beyond. He did not focus on either. He simply stood there, allowing the stillness to exist. Then he spoke, his voice low, even. Then this is not a matter of outcome. He paused briefly. It is a matter of nature. The distinction settled into the room without resistance. No one questioned it. No one attempted to redefine it. Because the meaning was already clear. Across the ocean, Hayes remained at the window, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. He did not move. He did not reach for anything. He spoke again, quietly, as if completing the thought. And nature does not reverse itself on command. The words carried no force, no urgency. They did not need to. They existed as something already understood. In London, the same steady continuation held. A clock moved forward, second by second. A door opened and closed. A voice spoke softly, then faded. These moments did not demand recognition. They did not need to. They were the structure of something that existed independently of observation. Back in Berlin, Falken turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the table. His movements were deliberate, his posture unchanged, but his presence now carried something different. Not authority, not control, something quieter. Something resolved. He placed his hand lightly on the table once more and spoke, his voice calm, measured, final. Then nothing we do changes what they are. The statement did not invite response. It did not require agreement. Because it did not exist as a theory. It existed as a recognition that had already taken root. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides, his expression neutral. He did not return to the desk. He did not reach for the reports. He did not need to. He spoke quietly, his voice steady. And what they are is already enough. In London, the man who had been walking reached his destination and stopped, his hand resting briefly on the door before he opened it. Inside, the room was simple, unchanged, filled with the same quiet details that had always been there. He stepped in without hesitation. Nothing in the space announced anything extraordinary. And yet, everything within it reflected something that had already been understood far beyond its walls. Back in Berlin, Faulkner remained at the table for a moment longer, then removed his hand and stepped back. He did not look at the map again. He did not look at the reports. He no longer needed to. The understanding had already reached its final state. The room did not move. No one spoke. The silence was no longer searching. It was no longer waiting. It was complete. Because in that moment, everything had aligned. Not through force, not through decision, but through recognition. And once recognition reaches that level of clarity, it does not change. It remains exactly as it is. Quiet, steady, and fully understood. In the end, the loudest moment is not when something breaks. It is when nothing does. The war room in Berlin no longer held tension, no longer carried the quiet pressure of expectation or the weight of unanswered questions. It had become still in a way that did not feel empty, but complete. General Erich Faulkner stood near the table one final time, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but there was no longer anything left for him to resolve. The map remained on the wall, untouched, its lines sharp, its colors fixed, but it had lost its final significance. It was no longer a tool for prediction. It was a record of what had already passed. Faulkner did not look at it. He had already moved beyond it. Around him, the officers remained at their positions, but their movements had slowed, their voices softened into something that no longer needed to define or defend. There was no argument left, no projection left, only understanding. Faulkner reached for the last report on the table, though the gesture felt more like closure than necessity. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the familiar lines one final time. No collapse, no withdrawal, no change. He reached the end and held the paper for a moment longer than before. Not because he expected anything different, but because the repetition had reached its final form. He folded the paper carefully and placed it down, aligning it perfectly with the others. Then he removed his hand and did not return to it. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Hayes stood by the window, the light from outside casting a steady glow across the room. He had not returned to the desk. He had not touched the reports. He no longer needed them. The pattern had already become something permanent in his understanding. He stood still, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his gaze steady, not searching, not expecting. He spoke quietly, his voice calm, measured. There is nothing left to prove. The words settled into the silence with quiet certainty, not as a conclusion, as a recognition that the process itself had ended. In London, the quiet rhythm continued exactly as it always had. A man stepped into a room and set down a small object on a table. A woman looked out a window, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. A child turned a page in a book, the sound soft, steady. These moments did not carry meaning in isolation. They did not need to. Together, they formed something that had already been seen, already been understood, in places far removed from their origin. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stepped away from the table and moved toward the window one final time. He stopped at the same distance, the reflection unchanged, the glass blending the room with the distance beyond. He did not look for anything outside. He did not expect anything to appear. He spoke quietly, his voice even, controlled. Then this was never about ending them. He paused briefly, then finished the thought. It was about understanding them. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with finality. No one responded. No one needed to. Across the ocean, Hayes remained still, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. He spoke once more, quietly, almost as if closing a thought that had been building for a long time. And now it is understood. The words carried no emphasis. They did not need to. They marked completion. In London, the same steady continuation held. A door opened and closed. A clock moved forward. A voice spoke softly, then faded. Nothing in these moments changed. Nothing needed to. They were the proof of something that had never depended on being observed. Back in Berlin, Faulkner turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the center of the room. His movements were deliberate, his posture steady, but his presence now carried something that did not need to be expressed. Not authority, not control, something quieter, something complete. He stopped at the table and looked at the reports one final time. Not to read them, not to analyze them, but to acknowledge them as the final record of a realization that no longer needed evidence. He placed his hand lightly on the table, then removed it, as if closing a chapter that did not require words. He spoke one last time, his voice calm, measured, almost indistinguishable from the silence around it. Then there is nothing left to change. The room did not move. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to add. Across the Atlantic, Hayes stepped back from the window and turned away, his movement steady, his direction clear. He did not look back at the desk. He did not reach for the reports. He walked forward, carrying the understanding with him, not as something to explain, but as something already settled. In London, the man who had been reading closed his book and set it down. He stood, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the handle, then opened it and stepped outside. The street remained the same, the rhythm unchanged, the movement steady. Back in Berlin, Faulkner stood still for a moment longer, then turned away from the table and walked toward the door. He did not look back at the map. He did not look back at the reports. He did not need to. The understanding had already reached its final form. The room remained as it was, unchanged, structured, silent. But the meaning within it had shifted completely. Not through force, not through decision, through recognition. And recognition, once complete, does not fade. It does not reverse. It remains quiet, steady, and permanent.